The Texas sun bled across the sky that evening, painting the dust in shades of fire and sorrow. 18-year-old Clara Reeves sat on the back of a creaking wagon, her wrists bound loosely with frayed rope, not because she was dangerous, but because her freedom had been sold along with her name. Her father, once a proud man beaten down by whiskey and drought, had traded her to a rancher he barely knew, just to settle a debt he couldn't pay. She didn't cry. She hadn't cried in years. The dry wind had stolen her tears long before the day she was sold. When the wagon stopped before a sprawling ranch surrounded by fields that shimmered like gold under the fading light, Clara's heart beat faster. The man who stepped from the porch wasn't what she expected. He was tall, broad-shouldered, quiet, his face marked not by cruelty but by weariness. His name was Jacob Holt, a man whispered about in town as the lonely rancher. Some said his wife had died years ago, others said he'd driven her away. But when his eyes met Clara's, she saw something she didn't understand, a kind of gentleness that didn't belong to a man who bought another person's life. Jacob spoke softly to the trader, counted the money, and without ceremony, turned to Clara. "You'll have your own room," he said, voice deep and steady. "You'll work here, if you wish. You're not my prisoner." But his words meant little to a girl who'd just been sold. She followed him into the house, her heart trembling between fear and defiance. The ranch was quiet, filled with the scent of wood smoke and horses. Every object in it seemed to hold a story: the worn rocking chair by the fire, the faded quilt on the sofa, the old photograph of a woman with kind eyes. Jacob noticed her gaze lingering on the picture. "My wife," he said simply. "She's been gone 7 years. Clara nodded, unsure what to say. That night, she sat awake on the narrow bed in the small room he'd given her. Outside, the coyotes howled and the wind scratched against the windows. She wondered if this house would become her cage, or if, by some strange twist of fate, it might become her refuge. Days passed, and life on the ranch moved with the rhythm of the sun. Jacob rose before dawn, worked hard, spoke little. He never raised his voice, never touched her. He treated her as if she were made of fragile glass, but not the kind that broke easily, more like something precious he didn't want to harm. Clara worked in silence, mending clothes, feeding the chickens, cooking simple meals. Every night, she caught him watching the horizon from the porch, like a man searching for something he'd lost long ago. One evening, a storm rolled over the plains. The wind tore through the ranch, and Clara ran out to gather the horses before the lightning struck. When she slipped in the mud, Jacob was there, pulling her up, shielding her from the rain with his coat. For the first time, their eyes met not as strangers but as two souls who understood loneliness. "You shouldn't have been out there," he said, his voice rough but not angry. "Neither should you," she replied, defiant but trembling. He laughed softly, a sound that startled them both. It had been years since he'd laughed like that. From that night on, something began to change. She started to hum while she worked. He began to speak more at supper. Small things, ordinary things, but in that quiet house, they meant everything. He taught her how to ride, patient and steady, guiding her hand when she held the reins too tight. She taught him how to smile again, though neither of them noticed it happening. The people in town began to talk. The ranchers bought himself a new wife. They'd whisper, but Jacob never answered rumors. He simply kept working, his world slowly brightening under the warmth of the girl who'd been sold to him. Clara still carried the ache of what had been done to her, but she found in him something she hadn't expected, a kind of freedom that had nothing to do with chains. One night, as the fire crackled low, she looked at him and said, "You could have sent me away, you know." Jacob turned the brim of his hat in his hands, eyes fixed on the flames. "Maybe," he said, "but sometimes God sends us what we need in ways that don't make sense." And for the first time, Clara felt her heart soften. She wasn't sure what the future held, but she knew this: she was no longer afraid. She'd found a place, a purpose, and maybe, even love. The stars outside burned bright and endless, like promises waiting to be fulfilled. And somewhere deep inside, the lonely rancher and the girl who'd been sold began to believe that broken things could still be made whole again. If you felt her journey stir something in your heart, don't forget to subscribe, because the story of Clara and Jacob has only just begun, and Chapter 2 will show how love tested by pain can either fade or become unbreakable. The winter that followed came early that year, wrapping the Texas plains in a rare hush. Frost clung to the fences, and the wind moved slower, as if it too had grown tired. Clara had been at the ranch nearly a year by then. What had begun as fear and obligation had turned, slowly and quietly, into belonging. The townsfolk no longer whispered when she passed through with supplies. They nodded politely, some even smiling. Jacob never said much, but his silence no longer felt heavy. It had become the kind of quiet that carried peace instead of loneliness. They worked side by side from dawn till dusk, mending fences, tending cattle, and sharing the simple rhythm of days that asked for much but gave back in small, honest ways. Every evening, they'd sit on the porch, watching the sunset stretch across the horizon like a promise. Clara would hum an old tune her mother once sang, and Jacob would close his eyes, letting the sound melt into the wind. He'd never said he loved her, not with words, but she could feel it in the way he left his coffee a little longer on the stove when she was late to breakfast, or how he fixed the hinge on her window before the first snow. Love, she realized, wasn't always loud. Sometimes, it was the quiet that stayed. As the days shortened, Jacob fell ill. It began with a cough that wouldn't leave and a tiredness that deepened with each sunrise. Clara begged him to rest, but he brushed it off, saying he'd worked through worse. One morning, she found him sitting by the barn, breath shallow, face pale as dust. Panic rose in her chest, but he only smiled faintly. "Guess I ain't as young as I used to be," he murmured. She helped him inside, made broth, wrapped him in blankets, and prayed harder than she ever had. For weeks, she nursed him through the fever, her heart breaking each time he coughed through the night. When he drifted into sleep, she sat by his side, whispering stories about the world beyond the ranch, the oceans she'd never seen, the cities she'd heard about, the dreams she'd once buried. She told him she forgave her father, that she no longer hated what had happened. Because if he hadn't done what he did, she whispered, I wouldn't have found this home. I wouldn't have found you. When Jacob finally woke fully one morning, his hand found hers on the quilt. You saved me, Clara, he said softly. No, she smiled through tears, you just remembered how to live. The illness passed with the cold, and by spring, the land began to bloom again. The horses grew restless, the rivers sang louder, and life returned to the soil. Clara planted wildflowers near the porch, the kind that danced when the wind moved, stubborn and bright, like her spirit. Jacob built her a small fence around them, saying, Can't have the cattle chewing up your beauty. She laughed and told him the flowers didn't need protecting. But deep down, she knew he wasn't talking about the flowers. Time softened everything. The memories of her old life became distant, almost like a dream she'd woken from. Jacob's hands, once rough and scarred, grew gentle when they brushed against hers, and the weight of the world that once sat between them began to lift. They never spoke of the day she'd been sold. They didn't need to. Some things were too sacred to reopen. Others healed simply by being held in silence. One evening, as the sun melted into gold over the fields, Jacob turned to her and said, You ever think about leaving, seeing what's out there? She smiled faintly. I used to, but I've learned something here. The world ain't about where you go, it's about who's beside you when the storms come. Jacob nodded, a glimmer of peace in his eyes. Then I reckon we've both found where we belong. The wind picked up, carrying the scent of rain and soil, and in that moment, everything felt whole, the house, the land, their hearts. Clara never thought she'd find love in a place built from dust and sorrow, but love, she realized, didn't always arrive like thunder. Sometimes, it came like the dawn, soft, patient, certain. Years later, when the neighbors spoke of them, they said the ranch never looked so alive as it did when Clara Reeves came to it. They said she brought laughter back to the porch, music back to the nights, and peace to a man who'd forgotten how to hope. And when Jacob's hair turned silver and Clara's hands grew calloused from years of work, they still sat side by side on that same porch, watching the light fade over the plains, content in the simple miracle of finding each other in a world that had once taken everything from them. As the final sunset of the story bled across the Texas sky, Clara leaned her head on Jacob's shoulder and whispered, "I think we made it, Jacob." He smiled, his voice quiet as the wind, "Yeah, darlin'. I think we did." And for the first time in her life, she knew she was free, not because someone gave her freedom, but because she had chosen it, and it had chosen her back. If this story touched your heart, remember to subscribe to the channel for more tales of love, courage, and second chances that shine through even the hardest storms.